The Nintendo DS had a lot of racing games. Some of them were genuinely quite good, others were interesting experiments that tried to push the handheld hardware in some weird directions. And then there were ones that existed purely because someone had a license and a deadline. Today we are looking at a game that sits somewhere right in the middle of that mess. Welcome to the Worst Racing Games, the internet series where you guys suggest different racing games that you think are terrible, and then I play them, review them, and rank them. So last week we had the surprisingly good Scars for the PS1, so we've kind of moved back in a sloppier direction to Ford Racing 3. It's a budget racing game handheld port based on a budget racing series running on a handheld that was still figuring out how to handle full 3D races. On paper, that combination doesn't exactly inspire confidence, but the funny thing about Ford Racing 3 is that it comes from the same studio responsible for what might genuinely be one of the worst racing games on the DS, Burnout Legends. Yes, that's Burnout Legends, one of the very first games I covered in this series, and probably to this day, still one of the worst games I've covered in this series nearly a year later. Which means the real question here isn't whether Ford Racing 3 is good, it's more a question of whether the developers managed to redeem themselves even just slightly after the absolute show that was the Burnout conversion. So my name is Kledge and we are going to dive into the world of Ford Racing 3. So before we talk about the DS version specifically, it's worth quickly talking about the Ford Racing series itself, because this wasn't exactly a blockbuster franchise. The Ford Racing games were mid-2000s licensed racing titles built entirely around one idea: you drive Ford cars. That's literally it, that's the hook. No massive open world, no deep sim systems, no dramatic story mode, just a lineup of Ford vehicles spanning several decades, racing around some competently designed fictional tracks. The third game in the series originally released on PC, PS2 and Xbox in 2004, and those versions were fairly typical arcade races for the time. Lots of Ford vehicles, a bunch of tracks, and a progression system based around unlocking cars and events. Then in 2005 the game got this handheld port for the DS. And that's where things start getting interesting, because porting racing games to early DS hardware was, well, tricky, as we know from Burnout Legends and Need for Speed ports. The system could handle 3D environments, but obviously it was nowhere near as powerful as home consoles of the time. Developers had to make compromises everywhere, with things like track complexity, vehicle models, physics calculations, and AI behaviour. Some studios handled that challenge really well. I mean, look at Ridge Racer on the DS, that's pretty cool. Others, not so much, and Visual Impact, which is the studio behind this version, had already proven that they definitely struggled with that balance. Just weeks before this game released, Burnout Legends, which if you ever played it, you'll know is borderline unplayable, so my expectations for this were, well, incredibly, extremely, very low. So booting up Ford Racing, the first thing that stands out is how normal everything kind of feels. There's no dramatic intro, no big presentation flourishes, just some menus, some modes, and a straightforward racing setup. Which low-key kind of works in the game's favour, because one of the biggest problems with many DS racers at the time was definitely ambition outpacing the hardware. Devs would try to replicate the full console experience, and the system would just crash and burn because it couldn't handle it. Ford Racing 3 avoids that trap just by keeping things simple. This is a very traditional arcade racing game. You pick a car, you race on a track, and you try to beat other cars to the finish line, and for the main mode, that's the entire premise. There's no damage modelling, no deep tuning system or customization. There's no attempt, well, certainly no attempt at hardcore simulation physics. It's just some racing. And while that might sound kind of boring, it actually helps the game feel focused in a way a lot of DS racers didn't. So let's talk about the car lineup. Since this is a Ford licensed game, of course the car list is entirely made up, you guessed it, of Ford vehicles. That means you get a mix of classic American muscle cars, some more modern sports cars, and some slightly weirder entries thrown in for variety. Cars like the Mustang, the Focus, the Thunderbird are all here, alongside trucks and other heavier vehicles. The roster isn't exactly massive compared to console racing games, but it's still a respectable lineup. The interesting part is how the game handles balance. Cars are divided into classes, which prevents something like a high-performance sports car from completely dominating a race against slower vehicles. So if you're racing trucks, everyone's using a kind of truck. If you're racing sports cars, everyone's in something at least roughly comparable. It's a simple system, but it works well enough for a game like this. Where things get slightly less interesting is the presentation of those vehicles. The car models themselves are fine. You can clearly tell what each car is supposed to be, but they lack the polish you'd expect from, well, a higher budget racing game. There's no fancy lighting or reflective surfaces, and the textures are very basic. To be honest, they look a bit dreary. It's not ugly, but it definitely screams budget title. Now, before we go any further, if you're a fan of racing games, retro racing games, or in this case, not so good racing games, then please consider hitting that subscribe button and tapping that bell to stay up to date with any future uploads. And if you haven't done so already, please consider hitting that like button. Anyway, let's talk some more about the graphics of this game. So in terms of visuals, Ford Racing 3 is actually quite surprising, because it runs surprisingly well. The game targets a smooth frame rate and generally sticks to it, which is something that couldn't be said for a lot of other DS races at the time. And more importantly, it actually manages to convey a decent sense of speed. This is something that Burnout Legends completely fail at, but here it works. The environments move past you quickly enough that racing feels fast, even if the graphics themselves are, well, relatively simple. The track environments are fairly varied in terms of layout, but aesthetically they're a bit bland. Forests, deserts, lakeside tracks, the usual racing game settings. The layouts themselves are actually pretty solid. There are some nice corners, elevation changes, and the occasional shortcut here and there. But visually, everything just feels a little bit flat. The colour palette in particular feels quite muted. At times it genuinely looks like someone applied the Zack Snyder colour grading preset to the entire game. Just lots of dull tones. It gets the job done, sure, but it's not exactly exciting to look at. And there are also some slightly awkward animation moments. Cars look a bit strange when they go airborne, and the physics during jumps feel especially weird. Vehicles float in a way that doesn't quite make sense, and then slam back onto the track like the game suddenly remembered about gravity. And if you drive into water, the car just kind of dives under the texture. It looks a bit funny, to be honest. Now we get to the part that makes or breaks any racing game, the handling. And Ford Racing 3 is inconsistent, to say the least. Different cars handle very differently from each other, which on paper obviously makes sense and is a good thing. A sports car should feel more agile than a heavy truck, and the game does reflect that. The problem is that the underlying physics system isn't really great. Steering can feel stiff and sometimes unpredictable, some cars corner nicely while others feel like they are sliding around on ice. And whenever airtime enters the equation, well, things start to feel especially awkward. Jumps don't feel satisfying at all, the physics during those moments look and feel off, like the game wasn't really designed with vertical movement in mind. But despite all of that, the handling isn't completely broken. You can adapt to it after a few races. Once you understand how each car behaves, it does become manageable. It's just not particularly refined. Now, in terms of gameplay variety, Ford Racing 3 actually includes a decent amount of content for a handheld racing game. The main mode is the Championship mode, which consists of several racing classes and tournaments. This is where you'll probably spend most of your time. As you progress through the Championship mode, you will unlock additional tracks, which gradually expands the available content. But if you want to get new vehicles, this is where things kind of get annoying. Because there's also a challenge mode, which mixes things up with a variety of different event types, but nearly every vehicle in the game is locked behind it. Some of these are fairly standard, like time trials or elimination races, but others are a bit more questionable. For some reason, Ford Racing 3 is absolutely obsessed with drafting. Drafting, for anyone unfamiliar, is when you drive closely behind another car to reduce air resistance and gain a speed boost. In small amounts, it's a cool mechanic, but in the challenge mode of Ford Racing 3, it shows up way too much. There are entire challenges built around drafting vehicles, and the concept appears in multiple game modes. The problem is that the way it's implemented with the AI can be quite frustrating, because most of the time in these drafting challenges you still have to race an opponent and draft another car, and sometimes the car you need to draft is way slower than you are, which means you have to awkwardly slow down just to stay behind them long enough to trigger the mechanic. And then in doing so, obviously you lose the position that you had. And then occasionally, the opposite happens. There's one challenge where, for me at least, the final car you need to draft drives off so quickly that catching up to it feels basically impossible. And then there's the relay race mode, where passing the baton to your teammate requires, well, take a guess, drafting them, which means you're constantly trying to line up perfectly behind AI cars that don't always behave predictably. It's a neat idea that wouldn't feel so problematic if the AI just worked a little bit better. So yeah, more about that AI, because the AI in this game is kind of weird. Sometimes it's completely brain dead, and other times it's surprisingly competent and moving to defend from me in a way that I'd expect from modern racing games. The biggest issue really is the rubber banding system, because if you're in first place, the AI cars will obviously stick very close behind you, even if you think you've built a massive lead. Other than the occasional moments of insane defense, they're not particularly aggressive drivers, so for the most part passing them isn't really difficult. But once you're ahead, of course they somehow manage to stay right up your ass regardless of how fast you're going. It's the classic racing game trick where the AI cheats ever so slightly to keep races competitive. Just the thing is, in some games it's less noticeable, and here it's, well, pretty noticeable. But now we need to talk about what might be the single biggest problem in the entire game: the collision detection. Collisions with the environment are mostly fine. If you slam into a wall, your car slows down, obviously that's normal, but collisions with other racers are an absolute mess. If you lightly tap the back of another car while you are both moving at speed, your car can grind to a near halt while the other vehicle gets launched forward like it's Vin Diesel activating his nitrous. It's just kind of ridiculous. Side-by-side racing is arguably worse. Even if it looks like your car isn't touching the other vehicle, the game might just register a collision anyway for the fun of it. And when that happens, one of two things usually occur. Either you get slowed down dramatically, like normal, or your car suddenly gets shoved sideways into a wall, which makes close racing incredibly frustrating. But in these games, surely close racing and competition is what's supposed to make it fun. Ford Racing 3 actively discourages you from driving anywhere near your opponents, and that to me is a very big problem. And I remember Burnout Legends had some absolutely horrendous collision detection as well, and it was worse in that game because the whole game was centered around crashing. Now, at least in terms of the audio side, the game is fine. The music is fairly bland, but it's serviceable. It's the kind of generic mid-2000s racing soundtrack that fills the background without really standing out. You probably won't remember any of it once you've stopped playing, because I don't. Engine sounds are decent, though they're not as varied as you might expect for a game built around so many different Ford vehicles. Still, considering this is a budget DS game, it does the job fairly well. Now, in terms of critical response to Ford Racing 3 at the time, reviews were very mixed. There weren't any really positive reviews, but there were some average ones and then some fairly low ones. But anyway, the game currently holds a Metascore of 49 out of 100 on Metacritic, which I guess is kind of fair. Maybe I'd put it a bit higher, but it's still not a very good game. Now, in terms of user score for the game, the DS version specifically has one user review, giving it a 0 out of 10. So shout out to this person, I guess, fair play. Now in terms of sales figures, the game wasn't exactly a record breaker, but in terms of budget level games, I think it actually sold kinda well, having estimated to have sold about 100,000 units, with the vast majority of those being in America. These stats are from VG Charts. Anyway, so now the time has come to rank Ford Racing 3 for the DS on our worst racing games tier list. This is miles ahead of Burnout Legends by the same company, but it's still not a particularly good game. There's decent gameplay variety, there's a nice lineup of cars, some decent track layouts, but the AI and especially the collision detection do pull it down by a significant margin. So for me, this game is going to join quite a few others in the rubbish tier. And it's going to sit quite far down in the rubbish tier alongside games like Noble Racing and Ants on the PS2. It's not a game that I would go out of my way to recommend to anyone, but if you did want to play Ford Racing 3, just play a home console version instead. But it's also not the disaster you might expect from a budget licensed racer on early DS hardware. And compared to some other racers that hit the system around the same time, it definitely could have been much worse. So while Ford Racing 3 isn't exactly a hidden classic, it's kinda weirdly fascinating. A game that's aggressively mediocre and kind of bad in places, but still somehow better than it had any right to be. Anyway, that takes us to the end of our look at Ford Racing 3, and with it this week's episode of Worst Racing Games. So let me know in the comments down below, what do you guys think of this port of Ford Racing 3? Have you played it? Are you gonna play it? Would you rank it any differently? And as always, pop any other suggestions you may have for the series down there as well, and I will add it onto the racing wheel. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to leave a like, and if you haven't done so already, subscribe and tap that bell for notifications. A massive shout out to my Patreon subscribers for the continued support, and all I really have left to say is thanks and goodbye.